of the British involvement, both in the attacks of today involving Sevastopol, as well as in the blowing up of the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines. These are blockbuster assertions. They are not things that you can assert are merely propaganda because of the implications, including military implications, that they have for the entire world. I'm only referencing that. There'll be more about that a little bit later in today's presentations. We just want to point out that back in May of this year, the Schiller Institute had hosted an online conference called U.S. and European Military and Security Experts Warn the Insanity of Politicians Threatens Nuclear War. What we're involved in is attempting to not wait for the politicians to become sane, but to bring the world to sanity. And the interventions that are going on, some of them conducted by members of the LaRouche organization, some of them not, are beginning to at least demonstrate that there are signs of intelligent life in the United States that intend to mobilize the population, which is presently paralyzed by the sort of surprise at the complete immobility of what they thought was a free and democratic electorate. They find out that that doesn't exist, and so they've been paralyzed. Diane Sayre, who is an independent candidate for United States Congress, has been out front on this from before people were aware of any of this. Right after the late February special military operation that was begun by Russia, Diane was very concerned and had expressed concern even before that about the possibility of the danger of thermonuclear war and the conflict, in fact, getting out of hand. Were there to be such a conflict? She began a campaign to qualify for the ballot in New York State. She fulfilled all of the requirements for any major candidate, not just for so-called minor candidates, but she wanted to run as an independent candidate, independent of the pestilence of the Democratic and Republican parties, and that's what she did. She also has been attempting, as best she might, to engage her opponent, Chuck Schumer, the sort of U.S. Senator for life from New York. He's been there for 42 years. And of course, we've seen the great improvements in New York City and New York State over that period of time. Earlier this year, Diane directly confronted him also and attempted to engage him in a dialogue, which has yet to really fully occur.
Sorry, I have to interrupt. You are right when you said you're a killer. We have this disaster in Afghanistan, which is a result. I have a speech. I'm running for Senate against you because of your policies. Because after 9/11, you voted to invade. We are doing a political thing. We killed 1 million people in Iraq. My sister was in Iraq. No, he is a killer. This is a terrible project.
Now, if you just joined us, we want to welcome you to today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan meeting, The Politics of Truth, the World Citizens Mobilized to Halt World War III. This past Thursday, and what you just saw was Diane Sayre, U.S. Senate candidate, independent candidate in New York, running actually on the LaRouche party, because you have to run on a party in New York. You can't run independent. You've got to be a member of a party. That itself should tell you something about the level of control and downright corruption actually in the New York State electoral system, but we can come back to that. This past Thursday, the Schiller Institute hosted a conference called the Conference for World Peace, Stop the Danger of World War. It was actually the second such session. This is basically something that was convened by the founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, former Congresswoman Maria de los Angeles Huerta of Mexico, and Congressman Benjamin Robles Montoya of Mexico. What we're going to do is show you an excerpt actually from Helga's opening remarks to that conference, followed by several other presentations, including from that conference. But we want to set the proper stage at the higher level so that we can deal with the emerging crises actually emerging hour by hour as we're sitting here today.
Well, I greet you wherever you may be. what brings this meeting together, which is actually a sequent meeting to one we had on October 7th, where with the distinguished congressmen and women from Latin America, it was clear to us that, we had to do an extra effort to mobilize the world population to the danger in which we are. And I think that one of the most disturbing facts about the present situation is that for those who have looked at the danger of nuclear war and the escalation, who are realizing that the vast majority of human beings on this planet have no inkling on what kind of a powder keg we are sitting. And if you think back to the early 80s, when we had the medium-range missile crisis in Europe, between the SS-20 and the Pershing II being directed against each other with only a few minutes warning time, you had hundreds of thousands of people in the street warning of World War III. And today, where the situation is so much more dangerous, there is very little, there are some demonstrations, but not in any, correspondence to the possibility of the extinction of civilization, which is what we are talking about, if only one nuclear weapon would be used. Just to give you a sense, we have today the 27th of October. Until October 30th, that's another 3 days, you have simultaneously the entire NATO and the entire Russian armed forces being involved in their annual nuclear exercise. That means the arsenals of the two largest nuclear powers are right now rehearsing a nuclear war, because that is the basis of the steadfast noon maneuver. That's the NATO maneuver, which is exercising the readiness of their nuclear arsenal. And given the fact that this is the main target is Russia, they are rehearsing a nuclear war against Russia.
Un segundo, ya regreso.
That means that the entire arsenal of B-52 bombers have been brought from the United States to the European theater. And at the same time, the Russians have their maneuver, also their regular annual maneuver called Grom, which is the Russian word for thunder. And they are also involved in a large maneuver, including the live missile launches. Now, given the tension, this is not just a routine maneuver, even though it has been declared by both sides to be that. But, this is in the middle of a situation in the Ukraine war, which is getting more dangerous by the day. This is in the context of all kinds of maneuvers. For example, remember that the Russian defense minister Shoigu just a few days ago had called all his colleagues, the defense ministers of the US, UK, France, and Turkey, warning them that, that they had intelligence about the Ukraine preparing a dirty nuclear bomb, which they then in a fake operation would blame Russia for. Naturally, this was denied by the Ukrainian side. But just yesterday, Shoigu continued this series of phone calls by calling the Indian and the Chinese defense ministers, also discussing this situation. Now, only a very short time ago, President Zelensky of Ukraine, in a meeting with Australians, had basically called for a preemptive use of nuclear weapons against Russia, which then was pulled back, and his aide said he didn't mean it that way. Stoltenberg, the NATO General Secretary, said that a victory of Russia in Ukraine would be a defeat of NATO and therefore could not be tolerated. And President Biden, only on October 6th, in a more or less private meeting, had warned about the use of tactical nuclear weapons from the side of Russia, which could lead to an Armageddon, which then also was corrected. Defense Secretary Minister Shoigu said that the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine is absolutely not on the table and not even on the horizon. And naturally, all of this takes place in the context of which side has what nuclear doctrine. I mean, it is an absolute fact that the Russian nuclear doctrine or military doctrine provides for the use of nuclear weapons only in the case that the territorial existence of Russia is at stake. And, that obviously is not the case under normal circumstances. While on the other side, since the Bush administration, the United States has a first strike doctrine. And that is something which is absolutely not discussed. And I think we have to discuss it because ever since the US has the prompt global strike doctrine, it does have the element of a first strike use. Now, when President Biden came into office in February or January 2021, he promised that he would basically clarify that and basically, correct the U.S. doctrine for a sole purpose only, that only in order to deter, a nuclear attack, or if necessary, retaliate a nuclear attack, would the United States themselves use nuclear weapons? So I think we need to have a very broad discussion among experts, among military experts. Is it acceptable to be part of NATO when the policy of that NATO is a first strike policy? Now, that is not some theoretical question very far away. We should note the fact that in February 2021, it was the leader of the Strategic Command, Admiral Richard, who had advised the Pentagon to change the likelihood of the use of nuclear weapons from not likely to likely. So that was the response. And just last week, the United States USS West Virginia ballistic missile submarine surfaced in the Arabian Sea, and now a Russian expert, Alexander Timokhin, wrote in the magazine Yusukrat, which is the Russian word for view, basically said that the very unlikely occurring of that Russian submarine surfacing, normally these submarines don't like to be seen and their location is supposed to be a secret, would have been a demonstration on the side of the United States that they are capable to deliver a first strike to disarm the Russian nuclear arsenals in a preemptive way and prevent Russian retaliation by basically putting such missiles on a flat trajectory rather than a ballistic one, and therefore shortening the flight time significantly, and therefore, depriving the Russian side of, basically going for a second strike, a counter strike. Now, I think that all of these developments are really reason to have a total alarmist situation. I mean, what is at stake is the existence of the human species. And we have discussed at the previous meeting on October 7th, that the fact that because if there would be a nuclear war, and it is the agreement of all competent military experts that there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear war, if one single nuclear weapon is used, the entire arsenal will be used, and that will be the end of civilization, because a nuclear winter would kill off, in all likelihood, those few billions who would survive the actual nuclear war and it would probably be the end of the human race, or at least in the form as we know it now. And if some miserable people would survive in the following years, one should remember the word of John F. Kennedy, who said that those who die in the first hours will be lucky as compared to those who manage to live on for a couple of weeks or months or even years. So therefore, because it is the existence of all of civilization which is at stake, we discussed that by definition makes that every person on this planet is a world citizen and has to think like a world citizen, because we have been catapulted to be representative of the one humanity whose existence is at stake right now. So this is why we want to escalate this mobilization. We want to bring it into all countries, and we want to evoke from a group of nations, whatever it may be, that they must address this condition. We must have an emergency session of the UN General Assembly, or another occasion would be at the upcoming G20 meeting in Indonesia, mid of November. But a group of nations has to come forward and offer an alternative to this danger.
Well, actually, we may be seeing an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council as early as Monday, depending on how various things go in the next 24 hours, given the attacks that happened this morning on the Russian city of Sevastopol, attacks which, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, were at least supervised by the British Defense Forces. If you're just joining us, we welcome you to today's Manhattan Town Hall meeting of the LaRouche Organization. The Politics of Truth, the world's citizens mobilized to halt World War III. We want to call your attention to something that we filed this morning. It was actually filed by Carl Osgood. People have seen him before on our platform, and we'll bring this up on screen so you can read it along with me. The Russian Defense Ministry issued a statement implicating the British in terrorist attacks in both the Black and Baltic Seas. Firstly, the statement reported that security elements of the Black Sea Fleet successfully repelled an attack on the Sevastopol naval base involving 9 aerial unmanned vehicles, drones, and 7 maritime unmanned drones aimed at Black Sea vessels in the outer and inner roads of the base. All of the drones were reported destroyed. The statement stressed that, quote, the ships of the Black Sea Fleet that were subjected to the terrorist attack are involved in ensuring the security of the grain corridor as part of an international initiative to export agricultural products from Ukrainian ports. Let me just update you that the Russians have suspended those grain payments as of now. The statement also charged that the preparation for the attack and the training of Ukrainian naval personnel involved in it, quote, were carried out under the supervision of British specialists in the city of Ochakov, Nikolaev region in Ukraine, end quote. The statement concluded that, according to the available information, representatives of this unit from the British Navy were involved in plotting, organizing, and implementation of the terrorist attack in the Baltic Sea on the 26th of November this year to blow up the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 gas pipelines. Now, just want to say, no one died in that, to the best of our knowledge, but from the standpoint of terrorist actions or actions that are carried out, which are either actions of war per se or actions of terrorism, certainly the Nord Stream 1 and 2 explosions, which are still, quote, unexplained, is the largest incident of its type since 9/11. And so there is something rather important to think about concerning what has been stated here. We return to the statement. According to RT, Russia Today, the British Ministry of Defense went ballistic over the Russian accusations. The ministry claimed in a posting on Twitter that Moscow, quote, is resorting to peddling false claims of an epic scale in an effort to detract the global community from, quote, their disastrous handling of the illegal invasion of Ukraine. The ministry went on to denounce the accusation as a, quote, invented story, which, quote, says more about arguments going on inside the Russian government than it does about the West. RT also notes that Maria Zakharova, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, has signaled that Moscow intends to draw the attention of the global community and the United Nations Security Council to, quote, a series of terrorist attacks against Russia in the Black and Baltic Seas and to Britain's involvement in the matter. So that could happen as early as Monday. Nobody exactly quite knows whether that will be the case or not. But again, as I say, you could also have other developments, including during tomorrow. So that's also notable. I want to just point out also that there's been a couple of responses from the United States. We are actually trying to bring these responses up and make them available. But one response came from Ray McGovern. People here are aware of who he is, former CIA analyst. He's been on our platform many times. He says in his tweet, Russia not likely, or I'll put it in this sort of non-Twitter English. Russia is not likely to blame the United Kingdom for, quote, supervising today's drone attack on Russian ships near Crimea and the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines without evidence. Serious chance of kinetic retaliation. That means non-nuclear, but kinetic retaliation. British air raid sirens at UK bases better be in working order. Now, Ray, yes, has a sort of sense of humor, but he's not saying that simply humorously. He means it. Now, what does that mean to you? Well, you just heard him talk about the possibility, or at least ask the question whether there's a possibility that there might in fact be a military response by Russia to Britain. And if that were the case, of course, now we're talking about the questions of the NATO alliance. Now we're talking about Article 5. And we're talking about people having to come to defense of one another, and we're talking about World War III, and you are not going to get a lot of notice about that. If you think that you'll get notice, I guess you then believe in the fantasy world of that recent New York City What to Do in the Case of Nuclear War ad. If you haven't seen that, maybe we'll be able to pull that up at some point during this and show it to you. So given this picture, and given the obvious urgency of the circumstance, what can Americans do? Well, one thing is to, first of all, take a look at history. We're in the middle of the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Several of us have commented about this over the course of the several weeks, but today we want to have Harley Schlanger, who's with us, LaRouche spokesman for the LaRouche organization, say a few things to us, not just about that, but about the entire sort of envelope of what we find ourselves involved in at this point. So, Harley?
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello to everyone. I'm struggling a little bit with my voice, but I'm pretty sure I can get through this because it's important for you to hear what we're working on. It was 60 years ago yesterday that the Soviet Union began dismantling the nuclear missiles on the base that was discovered in Cuba by U.S. surveillance flights. This was dismantled per an agreement between President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Chairman Nikita Khrushchev. Now, in commenting on this, the current ambassador to the United States from Russia, Anatoly Antonov, made the point that it was a back channel which facilitated this agreement, and such a back channel no longer exists today. There's a quote from Anatoly Dobrinin, who was the Russian ambassador to the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis, who made the comment about what it was all about, the danger that it represented for mankind. Dobrinin said the Cuban Missile Crisis revealed the mortal danger of a direct armed confrontation of the two great powers, a confrontation headed off on the brink of war thanks to both sides' timely and agonizing realization of the disastrous consequences. What I'm going to do today is give you a brief picture of what actually happened to head off the war, not the media story, the Hollywood story, but the actual picture, which has been put together through a release of documents after the 1989 collapse of the Soviet Union and in the 1990s, documents which give a picture that was before that not available to historians or government officials, but a picture that shows that not only was the world close to nuclear war, but it was an act of statecraft by President Kennedy and Chairman Khrushchev that headed it off, when both of them were forced to confront the war hawks in their governments. Now, the question is, with the danger of a World War III growing, as Dennis just laid out, can we achieve something like this today? If you look at the role of the British in escalating the situation, and I have little doubt that there's going to be found a British hand both in the Sebastopol attack and the North Sea pipeline explosions. We'll wait to get the evidence, although the evidence is being suppressed by the governments that are looking into it. But if you look at the question of the outside intervention of the British, you'll get a sense of where the direction from which these attacks and this war danger is coming. But I think there are a couple of parallels between the Ukraine situation and the Cuban situation which are necessary to look at. Now, when I say, can we stop this? You've seen from Dennis's presentation, Helga Zeppler-Rusch's keynote at a Schiller Institute conference. We've had a number of these conferences to offer an alternative to war and to explain what's behind the war, the economic collapse in the West, and the decision to impose a global top-down bankers dictatorship, which does not have room for sovereign nations. So you have the Schiller conferences on the one side where there's discussion, calls for legislative mobilization internationally. We have the youth of the LaRouche organization challenging the phony progressives in the Democratic Party who are, in the name of being for peace and for the good of mankind, are funding through the Congress the war effort in Ukraine, which is putting us on the brink of nuclear war. And our overall outreach is absolutely essential because our voice is one of the key voices at this moment. Now, let me start with this question of the parallel between Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Ukraine situation. President Putin responded to the continued efforts to move NATO eastward to the border of Russia in precisely the same way that John F. Kennedy responded when he found out in October 1962 of nuclear missiles being deployed in Cuba. Although Putin patiently tried to raise this question over 8 years, the issue that this addresses is those people who say Russia's military operation in Ukraine was unprovoked. Well, former CIA Russian analyst Ray McGovern has given a devastating critique to that argument, showing that in fact between the attacks on the civilian population in the Donbass, the move of sophisticated weaponry into Ukraine, we now know, for example, because they're openly discussing, that NATO was training the Ukrainian military for the last 8 years, not just in Ukraine, but on British soil and probably other NATO members' soil. So the idea that there was no provocation is false. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis, people said, well, the Russians, the Soviets are acting with no provocation. Well, you had the same problem then. In fact, the most significant was the deployment of Jupiter nuclear missiles in Turkey that had easy access to Russia, but also the full nuclear arsenal that was deployed along the border between East and West Germany, which represented a threat to Russia. So, given that situation, the Putin reaction to the West on Ukraine was very much the same as Kennedy's, although it did not incorporate a direct threat of war. What Putin said is that there must be security guarantees for both sides. Now, keeping that in mind, let's look at the other aspect of the narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis that most people know. The idea is that it was John F. Kennedy's personal courage which prevented war. And what do they mean by that? He didn't back down. He threatened to go to nuclear war to force the Russians to withdraw. And that's essentially the line that has been passed on through history books, through popular culture, through the news media, that had Kennedy appeased Khrushchev, it would have been a disaster. So that the idea that a compromise would be appeasement was what Kennedy had to fight. He also had to fight against his own team. Now, this gets to the question of Kennedy's real courage. It was not his willingness to go to the brink of nuclear war to stop the Soviets and get them to take out the missiles. It was his courage in standing up to the war hawks inside the executive committee of his government, which included the Defense Department officials, intelligence officials, and others. If you can show the photo, Jose, of the meetings that were taking place, here you see in the White House, there's McNamara's there. You had constant pressure from the military telling Kennedy that he's got to attack Cuba. The ExComm, which is the executive committee, advice to Kennedy was take out the bases with air attacks, invade Cuba, and overthrow Castro. When Kennedy came to them and said instead he's going to enact a blockade, a quarantine to keep further Soviet material from reaching Cuba, the military officials in particular exploded at that, but the whole committee was opposed to that, typified by the Air Force Chief of Staff, General Curtis LeMay, who spoke for the war hawks when he said to Kennedy, a blockade is, quote, almost as bad as the appeasement of Hitler at Munich. That was the line that kept coming up, and that's the line we hear today from the war hawks. If you appease Putin, then he's going to take over Europe. If you appease Putin, pretty soon they'll take over the United States. And on and on and on. Now, the reality is that Kennedy not only stood up to that, but he had the courage to recognize that pushing Khrushchev would have a negative consequence. That is, that you had to find a way out that worked for both people. Now, when Kennedy was being pushed to intercept the first Soviet freighter that was approaching the blockade, the naval blockade, he said, let it go through. Again, he was confronted with people saying, how can you do this? This is unacceptable. We said we're going to stop them. Kennedy at that point said to his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was one of his chief advisors, quote, we don't want to push him, Khrushchev, into a precipitous action. Give him more time to consider. I don't want to push him into a corner from which he cannot escape. And it was at that point that the decision was made that Robert Kennedy should begin meeting with the Russian ambassador, the Soviet ambassador in the United States, Anatoly Dobrynin. And they passed messages back and forth, which got to Khrushchev. Meanwhile, we now know Khrushchev was writing letters to President Kennedy, talking about the need to have a solution to this, which is not military. Now, the line that comes out, or what ultimately happened is on August 27th, or on August 26th, Khrushchev made a proposal, which is that if the Soviets withdraw missiles from Cuba, then Kennedy must say the United States has no intention of invading Cuba and overthrowing Castro. Now, that was controversial for the ExComm members because they said, well, that's still a concession. It's a compromise. But they were talking about it when Khrushchev came back with another proposal the next day, which was that in return for the removal of the missiles from Cuba, the U.S. should remove its Jupiter nuclear missiles from Turkey. Now, this was also considered completely unacceptable. So what happened is that Kennedy through his brother, sent a message to Khrushchev saying, "We agree to your terms. We will remove the missiles from Turkey, but not right away, and we won't make a public announcement on it." Because Kennedy knew the environment was so heated in this Cold War situation, and the war hawks controlled the media and controlled really the Congress. He knew that if he were seeming to be backing down, it would be impossible. Khrushchev accepted this offer, and as a result, the compromise was reached that the missiles would come out of Turkey in the future. It took 6 months before they started to take them down. But the very next day, October 28th, the Soviets started dismantling the missiles there. Now, what's interesting is the relationship between Kennedy and Khrushchev. If you can show that photo again. There was a famous summit in Vienna in 1961 where the two of them met. And charitably, let's say it was a disaster. They talked. They had very little agreement. Kennedy felt as though Khrushchev might actually walk up to him and knock him down. It got very intense at certain points. And when Kennedy left, he was extremely fearful that we were headed toward a confrontation which could be a nuclear war. And yet, the letters that Kennedy got from Khrushchev during the period leading up to the Cuban Missile Crisis and during the Cuban Missile Crisis, as well as the back and forth discussion between Robert Kennedy and Dobrynin, gave Kennedy a different picture. There are a number of comments on this from people who are directly involved. For example, Khrushchev's son, Sergei, wrote that after Dobrynin met with Robert F. Kennedy, he told Khrushchev that Robert Kennedy told him that the military, the U.S. military, is, quote, putting great pressure on him, on President Kennedy, insisting on military action against Castro. He told Dobrynin, quote, "The president is asking for help to solve this problem." In his memoirs, Khrushchev wrote that during this period of time, he told his foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, quote, "We," meaning himself and President Kennedy, "have a common cause to save the world from those pushing us toward war." And we have a third eyewitness, Norman Cousins, the editor of Saturday Review, who later became a channel to Khrushchev to follow through with the agreement to sign the test ban treaty. Cousins wrote that Kennedy told him that he recognized that Khrushchev faced similar pressure from within his government. Quote, "He would like to prevent nuclear war, but is under severe pressure from his hardline crowd, which interprets every move in that direction as appeasement. I've got similar problems," Kennedy told him. Now, I think that shows something quite unique, that Kennedy's courage was not the willingness to risk a nuclear war. It was his courage to recognize that compromise is not appeasement, and to recognize the interest of the other. What he was basically saying is that if he were in Khrushchev's shoes with US missiles surrounding the Soviet Union, maybe he would be inclined to put missiles in Cuba to show the United States what it's like. Khrushchev actually said that part of his decision for deploying the missiles was to show the United States what it's like to have missiles right next to your border. So Kennedy, instead of responding to that militarily, took into his thoughts that it's not acceptable to destroy the human race to prove that he could be tough and stand up to the Soviet chairman. And so the reality is, the line then that went out was that it was Khrushchev who blinked. Khrushchev backed down. The U.S. won because the U.S. didn't appease. And this is still the line that's taught in many cases. It's certainly the thinking that you find in people like Blinken and others, the whole NATO crew, basically saying that the reason that Ukraine has to be armed, the reason Ukraine has to win this war, is we can't appease the Russians. Well, the lesson from the Cuban Missile Crisis is compromise is not appeasement. It's statecraft. It starts from a higher standpoint, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche has called the coincidence of opposites, that you recognize that there's a higher principle than merely showing your toughness, merely standing your ground. And the recognition of legitimate concerns of other nations is not only not appeasement, but that's the only way you can resolve these problems. Now, there are very interesting quotes from someone who played a leading role in backing up President Kennedy, one of the few people in the ex-com that actually did, but who was slandered and attacked because of his commitment to accepting the trade with the Soviets. And that was the UN ambassador, Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson was considered by the military a weakling. And yet when he presented the case that for the blockade at the United Nations, John Kennedy was quite impressed when he stood up to the Russian ambassador. The Soviet ambassador would not answer the question, do you have missiles in Cuba? Are you going to take them out? And Stevenson then said, well, I'll wait here until I get an answer for you. And Kennedy thought, well, Adlai is showing some toughness. But Stevenson, at the same time, in this October 16th meeting, when the drumbeat was for war and invasion, Stevenson the next day sent out a handwritten memo to John F. Kennedy. And what he wrote to counter the hardliners is, quote, blackmail and intimidation, never. Negotiation and sanity, always. Now, just a final point on this is to look at the fact that John Kennedy won the 1960 election in part by saying he would be tougher on the Soviets and on Castro than the Eisenhower administration had been. The United States was in the height of a Cold War. The anti-Soviet sentiment was very high. There was a confrontation in Berlin in 1961, which led to the building of the Berlin Wall. War nearly broke out over the Berlin crisis. And so you had this ongoing situation, which brought out the testosterone-charged insanity of the military and much of the media clamoring for doing something to show the United States is tough enough to win the Cold War. Now, this led to a comment from Stevenson, which I think is highly appropriate and should be considered by those today who are pushing for war. And if I could have the last photo, Jose. Well, John Kennedy had the courage and the commitment to stand up and do what was right. He showed reason and empathy rather than revenge and tough and brutality. Here we have a US president who, for all intents and purposes, seems to be somewhat befuddled by the whole situation. But here's what Stevenson wrote. And this is something that if President Biden had any good sense, he would be repeating every single opportunity he could. What Stevenson said in an interview with Time magazine was, quote, we seem to be living in an era where anyone who is for war is a hero, and anyone who is for peace is a bum. Let me just repeat that. Anyone who is for war is seen as a hero, and anyone who is for peace is a bum. What we need today is more bums like John F. Kennedy, and we need more citizens to stand up and insist that the recognition of the rights of other sovereign nations is the basis of a peaceful future. And that kind of compromise is what's needed to resolve the situation that we now face in Ukraine.
Thank you, Harley. And I'm going to ask you to actually comment on something. I mean, besides that, of course, the idea of compromise is not appeasement. Deliberation is also not brainwashing. And we have a comment, or at least a portion of a comment from a speech that Vladimir Putin gave this week. I mean, actually, it was 4.5 hours altogether, and there were references to Karl Popper. There were references to other kinds of philosophical ideas, various different thinkers of Russia, questions and answers, and as was said by some of the commentators, in particular Alex Mercouris, I think from the Duran, that there's not another world leader, probably, perhaps Xi Jinping is an exception, that could do that. And if you were to, and hopefully there won't have to be that if if nuclear war were being fought on the basis of who was actually capable of walking an idea from one side of their mind to another, let's just say that the West would be in seriously problematic waters. This is what Vladimir Putin said in part. I wanted to get your comment on this. The so-called West, which is, of course, a theoretical construct, since it is not united and clearly is a highly complex conglomerate. But I will still say that the West has taken a number of steps in recent years, and especially in recent months, that are designed to escalate the situation. As a matter of fact, they always seek to aggravate matters, which is nothing new either. This includes the stoking of war in Ukraine, the provocations around Taiwan, and the destabilization of the global food and energy markets. To be sure, the latter was, of course, not done on purpose. There is no doubt about it. The destabilization of the energy market resulted from a number of systemic missteps made by the Western authorities that I mentioned above, that is earlier in his speech. As we can see now, the situation was further aggravated by the destruction of the pan-European gas pipelines. This is something otherworldly altogether, but we are nevertheless witnessing these sad developments. Global power is exactly what the so-called West has at stake in its game. But this game is certainly dangerous, bloody, and I would say dirty. It denies the sovereignty of countries and peoples, their identity and uniqueness, and tramples upon other states' interests. In any case, even if denial is not the word used, they are doing it in real life. No one except those who create these rules I have mentioned is entitled to retain their identity. Everyone else must comply with these rules, meaning the rule of law and the rules around gender and the rules around culture and so forth. Now, I think there are two things that are notable. I just wanted to see what your take would be on what we just heard. One is that he clearly is moving, and I think Russia also, to differentiate among different tendencies in what's called the West. Of course, notably, those of us at the LaRouche organization don't really use that term. We may allude to the term. It may be used here and there, but we recognize it's a very sloppy idea. And when you look at British interests are not American interests. Now, that's something that we may have to remind a lot of Americans of. Eisenhower knew that, as he showed in the case of the Suez Crisis, when in fact the British and the French in that case, others were involved as well, sought to take actions against Egypt in the case of the Suez Canal, and Eisenhower slapped them and stopped it. That's sometimes referred to, by the way, by British historians like Derek Liebert as the end of the dominance of the world, of the superpower called Britain, that it ended in the case of the Suez Crisis with what was done by Eisenhower. So I'd just like to get your take on first what Putin is saying here, and any other thoughts you have on what this idea of the so-called West and a way in which it may be being submitted to sort of dissection at this point.
Well, I think President Putin was being too kind when he said the collapse of the food and energy markets was not done on purpose. If you actually look at the policies that have been introduced, it was done on purpose. The consolidation of the grain cartels to have the prices set in spot markets and in speculative markets as opposed to the actual legitimate cost of products, the sanctions against Russian oil and gas, but also against Iran. Putin has on other occasions referred to this as the self-suicide. And I think if you look at it, it's very clear that the transatlantic policy has been to fight the war in Ukraine to the last Ukrainian and to get NATO to stick to that war to the last European. You know, the few that may survive this winter, if it's going to be a cold winter and there's no energy and the policy continues to fight the war, and these kinds of provocations, such as the blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipelines, the drone attacks in the port, if these things happen, this is part of a self-suicide of the West, of the transatlantic. But I think the other thing you have to look at here is the author of this policy. Now, we've seen these new recent national security documents from the United States going back to 2017 through 2020, which essentially said, well, now it's time to drop the global war on terror and take up the serious question of the world powers, the great powers that are contesting against the United States. And they named Russia and China. Now, what's the policy look like? Well, for this policy to succeed for the United States, you need to have Europe on your side. And that's one of the key intents. But what happens when the Europeans recognize that their interests are not for war, are not for destabilizing Russia and China, but actually working with them, trading with them, having a cooperative relationship? Well, this is what we're seeing being fought out now over such things as the Nord Stream pipeline. Who benefited from the blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline? Now, some commentators say, well, obviously the United States wants to sell its liquefied natural gas in Europe, and that's why it was done. No, that's not it. That's too simple. That may be how you sell it to the people who are selling the liquefied natural gas. But the issue here is the Russia-German relationship, which for the British, for 140 years or longer, has been at the center of their strategic policy. You have to break the potential of a Russia-German alliance and more broadly a Eurasian integration with Western Europe, because that undermines the power of the City of London both to control global financial policy and trade policy. And so pitting Russia and Germany against each other is a central feature of that. Now, do the Americans know that? This is an interesting question, because it's clear that the officials who are making U.S. policy are getting their talking points from such institutions as the Atlantic Council, which is funded by the State Department and the British Foreign Ministry, among others, and is pushing for war. In fact, it's pushing for nuclear war. Chatham House, which is British intelligence, the Council on Foreign Relations, which was set up by Chatham House to keep America connected to Europe. So all these think tanks speak the same language. It's the geopolitics of Mackinder, which was updated by Zbigniew Brzezinski in his Grand Chessboard 1997 work. So when you look at what Putin is looking at, he's looking at a policy which is actually against the interest of every single nation in the transatlantic, including the United States. Now the question is, when will American political leaders recognize that? We saw a mild effort from the so-called progressives in the Democratic Party to call for negotiations, although it was quite weak, but it was stomped on immediately. And they immediately backed down. All but one of them withdrew the letter. And why was that? Because the war hawk policy dominates both parties. the neocon view that the U.S. must remain the sole superpower. So this idea of the sole superpower is what Kennedy was confronted with. Should the United States risk global annihilation through nuclear war to show that it can be trusted? And if that's what you have to do to be trusted, what's the benefit of being trusted? And this is where you see the brainwashing of political leaders, of military leaders, of think tankers, of academicians into this sole superpower worldview. And this is what Putin is standing up against. And the interesting point is he's recruited a lot of other nations who don't have to be bribed to become anti-transatlantic, anti-British. They know what has been done by this transatlantic, this Anglo-American policy in the last 30 years, war after war after war. So I think what we're seeing with Putin is a statecraft similar to the approach that Kennedy took. Now the question is, can we find a Kennedy in the West? And if not, we have to take up the mantle and make sure that the people refuse to accept the idea that in order to make the military look good, we have to risk nuclear war.
Okay, thanks a lot, Harley. Actually, we have several things, and if you've just joined us, you're looking at the politics of truth, the world's citizens, mobilize a halt World War III. Actually, at this point, Harley, you're going to be able to rest your voice in any case because we have so many other matters. I'll just indicate to people we have some of the interventionists that have appeared around the world, but particularly in the United States. They'll be joining us here shortly. Before we do that, what we want to do is to at least give you a reason to visit and watch the conference that just happened this past Thursday, Schiller Institute conference, which was called For World Peace, Stop the Danger of World War. This is an initiative that Helga Sepp-LaRouche, together with various people, particularly former Mexican Congresswoman Maria de Los Angeles Huerta of Mexico, had begun. What we're going to do is to just show, we showed Helga earlier, we're going to just briefly show us some excerpts from former Congresswoman Huerta, Congressman Benjamin Robles Montoya of Mexico, and then Antonio Ingroia, a judge, former judge from Sicily. And just so people have a sense of that, and then we'll return from there to our discussions, and I believe we have several of the people with us live on the line to review some of the work that was done this week and comment on that. So if we can go to the conference video.
We cannot continue to be mere spectators of a possible planet-wide disaster. We must transform ourselves right now into active citizens of the world that we want, the world that we must change. I believe this is the most important thing right now, a collective awareness that being mere spectators is no longer viable, never was, but far less so at this time. So we believe that in order to achieve this radical transformation away from devastation and inequality, moments in which our peace, integrity, and world security are threatened, all of us as human beings, as Helga has emphasized, need to act, to get moving. My specific proposal at this time is that we build an organization for global collective action, as has been previously mentioned, because we need to be already a force with a determining influence in the international dialogue, and we must also establish a presence that will help to define peaceful solutions and reorient the architecture, the economic and security architecture, as has always already been mentioned. Friends, the issue of Ukraine, if you will allow me to give my opinion, is an inevitable corollary of a crisis throughout the world economic crisis provoked by an imperial party that controls all monetary movements, transfers of real or fictitious money to preserve its wealth and power. But this is at the expense of poverty, misery, the destruction of many nations, and of course, through interminable means of acquisition through debt. This is a problem that requires an immediate solution because these monetarist mechanisms, which you know so well, cannot be allowed to continue. This power is embedded in local institutions throughout the planet, where we see how private national armies are deployed under the protection and the two of the corporations or banking networks to accumulate natural resources. These corporations and institutions who manipulate interest rates also come out ahead. So even illegitimately, they still come ahead. I make this comment because a recession and inflation, in my view, are induced to increase the rate of liquidity required for their survival and to continue exerting tyrannical power and imposing misery and austerity on millions upon millions of human beings. Therefore, it is the time to raise our voices efficiently in a way to bring about great transformations in the world. Here in Mexico, as many of you most likely know, the President of the Republic, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has identified this problem with absolute clarity. This is why he recently proposed an immediate halt to the war between Russia and Ukraine and proposed an urgent reorganization of the United Nations organization to place it at the service of humanity. I also believe that governments of all nations must join this initiative, not looking at how to sanction those involved, but how do we join together in stopping this immediate, immense problem. For this reason, I would like to present to your consideration the formation of a group of legislators representing all of the contents and nationalities to enter into a direct dialogue with the rulers of every nation interested in world peace and the implementation of a new UN, as Mexican President López Obrador suggests, as well as a new world order following new principles for humanity and fighting corruption against development. So, friends, we've had occasion to live a moment of huge challenges as well as opportunities. We must not waste this opportunity. We cannot say farewell to the opportunity for peace and to bring development to the 7.5 billion human beings living in 206 nations and geographical regions. Therefore, I suggest that all the work that can be accomplished this morning is completed for the benefit of all nations. I am very proud to participate with you in this seminar, and all of you are embraced from the Mexico City and from the halls of Congress for participating in this great journey towards peace.
Buongiorno, buon pomeriggio a tutti coloro che partecipano a questo importante.
Good afternoon
to all those who are participating in this important event, and thank you for inviting me. I am a jurist, and I have been an anti-mafia magistrate in Italy for many years. Today, I'm a lawyer, and I also do political work for a political movement called Italia Popolare e Sovrana, Sovereign and Popular Italy, that fights for peace. Greetings to the Mexican parliamentarians and former parliamentarians. I've been in Mexico many times, involved in conferences and training activities in the fight against organized crime and for peace. I believe that the world is living today a terrible and very difficult moment because we are on the threshold of the Third World War, and this Third World War risks to become a nuclear war. And as many great thinkers of the world say and warn us, could even cause the extinction of our human species. We have before us the risk of a great nuclear catastrophe. I live in Italy, in the city of Rome, and we in Italy, as in all of Europe, are the most exposed to this risk of a nuclear war. Therefore, we must act immediately and start a peace negotiation. I think Europe has a key role. Europe can make and must make the first move. With our NATO nuclear armament, we are in fact in danger of being directly involved in the conflict, and that's why we have to make an appeal to the Italian government. We have made an appeal to the Italian government that has just taken office, and we need to tell the Italian government and all governments in Europe and the world that it's time to take a step towards peace. How? First of all, a truce, an immediate ceasefire, all weapons should stop. And we should stop sanctions against Russia, since sanctions against Russia are a measure of war. Italy is at war. Italy must get out of this war and start its peace negotiation. I think Italy has to do it because of its history. I am very happy that there is a prestigious assembly of men and women from various parts of the world who have signed this appeal for peace. I join this appeal, and so I give my thanks to everybody for this initiative and endorse your appeal for peace to move away from the risk of this nuclear spiral. Adelante, with courage, e buena suerte.
All right. So what we're going to now do, actually, Harley, you may have a comment about that, but I'm going to ask you to hold it because we have a veritable army of interventionists who have assembled themselves, been assembled, and we're, there they are. They're all on screen. Ooh. So they're going to have to, they're going to all introduce themselves, although I know them all, because here's how we're going to do it. We're going to first, well, so everybody who's watching knows what this is about. We'll set the stage for this by playing a short video, which was done on the Jimmy Dore show, which was then being hosted by Aaron Maté. And that will say more than I need say about what we are about to discuss, and we'll go right into the discussion from there.
Hey everybody, it's Aaron Maté sitting in for Jimmy Dore here with America's comedian Kurt Metzger and Max Blumenthal, editor of The Gray Zone. We're talking about how Democrats in the Progressive Caucus caved after releasing a letter calling for diplomacy with Russia to end the Ukraine proxy war. And that letter came out not long after AOC, who was one of the signatories of that letter, was heckled by anti-war protesters who were urging her to stop voting for a war that is fueling tensions with the nuclear armed power and is bringing us closer and closer to the threat of nuclear war. And AOC responded to that by accusing the protesters of parroting pro-Putin talking points. Well, AOC is not the only Democratic lawmaker being confronted by anti-war activists. It now happened to Elizabeth Warren, Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Congress member Ayanna Pressley, another member of the squad, and they were confronted at an event in Massachusetts.
Senator, you have got to stop funding a Nazi-infested Ukrainian regime. You are bringing us to the brink of nuclear war. You have got, those billions could be used for a lot of good things here in the U.S. Instead of funding Nazis in Ukraine, they're preparing a dirty bomb to detonate and blame on Russia.
This is not why we're here today.
I am here to make sure that billions of lives are saved instead of getting into a nuclear war. You've asked me, I heard you.
Yes.
I will move towards the neighborhood.
This is not.
Yes,
That's
right. No. Nuclear war.
Need to benefit from
yes,
this.
I'm black and brown too.
So let them get the information.
And I don't want them to die in a nuclear war.
This way, sir, please.
My tax money is funding because the Congress and the Senate are funding Nazis in Ukraine. Do you want a nuclear war? A nuclear war will cancel your debt and your life. I have sent letters, I have sent emails, I have made calls to these senators and congressmen. They refuse to respond. We are marching to nuclear war behind fools in political office. They have got to stop it.
Thank you.
Nuclear war is the issue. Nuclear war. Consideration.
None of this matters. None of this matters if there's a nuclear war and we all die. In 2018, it was illegal.
Cancel student debt! 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 Cancel student debt!
Oh man, that was cancel student debt to drown out calls for funding communities in the U.S. instead of war.
Exactly. And the second protester who spoke, he was hard to hear, but what he was saying was that in 2018, Congress passed a law banning assistance to the Azov Battalion, the neo-Nazi paramilitary force that's incorporated into the Ukrainian military. And he got drowned out when he was saying that, but he was trying to remind the members of Congress what they had previously voted for and are now basically flagrantly violating by supplying an army that includes the Azov Battalion, where they're playing a major role. But we're seeing here one of the few flashes of the anti-war movement in the U.S. are coming with people protesting progressive members of Congress like Elizabeth Warren and AOC.
Okay, so the two individuals who did that intervention are with us, and I'm going to ask them to start in making comments. So let me start. Let me have Bill, why don't you start, Bill, and then we'll go to Sam. So introduce yourself and tell us what you were doing.
I've been organizing with the LaRouche movement since 1981, most of the time in Massachusetts. And I felt it was, especially following on what Kynan and Jose were able to do with AOC, is my duty to confront my senator and Congressman Pressley on this question. I can't talk to Putin. I'm not responsible for the defense of Russia, but I'm responsible for what the United States does. And as I said, my tax money shouldn't go to a war that could lead to nuclear extermination. And it definitely should not be going to Nazis. It wasn't the kind of situation where you could elaborate on that, but frankly, the misery and suffering that the Ukrainians are going through is a result of a U.S. sponsorship of a fascist coup in Ukraine. And Azov doesn't just shoot Russians. Anybody over the last period since the coup in 2014, that spoke out against what the regime was doing was targeted, beaten up, driven into a building and set on fire by Azov and their associates. Now, the United States did that. We did that to Ukraine. So as a citizen, I saw it as my duty to speak up, to tell elected representatives, this is not what the United States should be doing. And the stakes are as high as nuclear war, extermination of the human race. I'll just say that I had just met Sam a couple of days before, and we got together for several hours and deliberated exactly what we were going to do, given what we knew the situation would be. And I think things went very well. And I think that was his first opportunity for such engagement with the elected representatives, and he did an excellent job. So let's go to him.
Yeah. Okay. So Sam.
Yes. Yes. Hello. Yes, I'm Sam Netman, and I feel much the same way as Bill described. You know, because the war there's made a continuous escalation and many kind of irrational decisions that I think need to be brought to light. The political messaging and the media is just to make one side entirely good and one side entirely bad. And that's the only way to keep people, you know, keep the Ukrainian flags in the front yards of the country. But it's not sustainable when people know what is going on. And that's why I try to bring them to light.
Okay, well, actually, you're not the only person that did this for the first time. Actually, I believe that Kynan's intervention, which became sort of well-known globally, was your first time doing that too. Is that right, Kynan?
Yeah, that's right. It was my first time. I was supposed to work that day, but Jose told me that I should go to this intervention instead, so that's what I did.
Okay, and that one is well known. We'll probably get to watch that. I mean, I think is that available? We just to get at least Kynan's portion of that. You have that, Jose?
Yeah, maybe I do. Let me see here if I can pull this up real quick. And I'll just say for the record, I did not say he should do this instead. I strongly urged him to appeal to reason as to what he thinks he should do. So
I don't think we need the qualification. It was clearly done.
Okay. Yes. Let me see if I have it at hand here. If you can give me just 30 seconds. Oh, actually, never mind.
I don't mean to one-up anyone, but I did manage to do a second intervention in the same day.
I was going to mention that.
And that was
Sam nailed Senator Markey. We got both our senators on the same day.
Oh, okay.
He did it at the belly of the beast at Harvard.
All right.
Yeah,
okay. I got the AOC video up here if you'd like me to play this.
Senator Markey was speaking at the Harvard Institute of Politics, and I asked him if he was intended to continue escalate the war and, you know, fight to the last Ukrainian, or was he going to start working towards peace? And he did a long answer about like appeal to emotion about Ukrainian children. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, right.
So
I'm sure the homeless of Boston were really deeply moved by his concern. Right. Let's just take a brief look at what we well, for people that may not know this, there are approximately 30 million plus people have seen what you're about to see if you're seeing it for the first time.
Congresswoman, none of this matters unless there's a nuclear war, which you voted to send arms and weapons to Ukraine. Tulsi Gabbard, she's left the Democratic Party because they're a bunch of war hawks, okay? You originally voted, you ran as an outsider, yet you've been voting to start this war in Ukraine. You're voting to start a thermonuclear war with Russia and China. Why are you playing with the lives of American citizens? You're playing with our lives. There will be.
Okay, so now I understand though that we also have a live report, a kind of this just in, and I don't know if we have the audio or video from it, but we have the live representative, and that would be Anastasia Battle. And if you'd like to tell us what you were just involved in, people may be interested.
Yeah. Well, my husband and I, Stuart Battle, and myself, we just intervened on Obama, who was here at a very large campaign event to get out the vote for all the Democrats. We got to vote Democrats. And he preempted the intervention by saying that people are trying to spread hatred, and this is highly coordinated, and it's evil. You know, you got all these people who are trying to do terrible things to create division in the country. Nuclear war is creating division in the country. You know, I mean, what audacity to say that, you know, we'll have the right to speak or something like that, when the only candidate to my knowledge who's willing to talk about nuclear war, Diane Sayer, is being censored and cut from a debate. Nobody's able to talk about this. No one's able to talk about nuclear war. So as soon as he started to talk about, you know, this kind of stuff, my husband stood up and started going after him and said, hey, you know, actually, maybe we'll have the video with the audio. I don't know if that's up. I can't remember exactly how he had put it.
No.
Yes,
I think we may have it. Is that the case?
You have it?
I do have it. Just give me like 15 seconds here while I make the screen disappear, Anastasia. Just like give us a little bit of context of what the event was about while I bring this up here. It'll be a little awkward.
So you had Rashida Tlaib, who was one of the signers of this letter of the progressive Democrats that were trying to have a pretty lame diplomacy reach out to Biden. She was there. The Governor Whitmer was there of Michigan. The Secretary of State of Michigan was there. The senators of the state were there. Many congressmen were there. I mean, it went on for a long time, many hours, until finally it got to Obama. And I mean, it was very tempting to want to say something to Rashida Tlaib because, you know, what she did with this letter. But I restrained myself because I thought it was more important that we went after the Nobel Peace Prize president, who is the one that set up the nuclear war apparatus that's happening now. And that's what we did. So I think, Jose, you've got the video for that now.
Yes, I do here. Let's see if this works, though. I hope people can hear this. So I just kind of put this rough together. There's no subtitles, but the audio is pretty clear. So let's see if this works.
You overthrew Ukraine in 2014! You overthrew the legitimate Ukraine in 2014! Tell us about your plans for nuclear war with Russia! Stop provoking nuclear war with Russia! You're going to kill us in nuclear war! Russia's the enemy! Russia is not the enemy! Russia's the enemy! Stop getting us into nuclear war with Russia! No nuclear war! Victoria Nuland financed the overthrow!
Mr. President, there's more people that are going to get hurt if we go into nuclear war. Right now, we're on the verge of nuclear war thanks to what you did in Ukraine in 2014. Why won't you tell the truth about what you did to overthrow Ukraine in 2014? Will you tell the truth? Will you tell the truth?
There is a process that we set up in our democracy.
Yeah, but we're on the verge of nuclear war. Do you care about the lives of your supporters? Will you tell the truth before the world walks into world war? The coup of 2014 is on your doorstep. You were the one that allowed for radical.
Yeah.
Bad mistake. Bad mistake. He responded. The drone responded. Here's a question. I'd like to pose a question. I'll pose this first to Billy, but also to Bill Ferguson. Anyone can answer it. But do you think that it's possible that British intelligence arranged a year-long performance of Othello with Biden playing Othello and Obama playing Iago? And that's what we all think was the 2020 election process. Harley, what do you think about that? The fact is, I think it was Alexander Mercouris brought up, he compared the coup that just happened in Britain, right? Because he said this was not an election. Everybody knows this who follow British politics, that the now appointed prime minister, there was no election. The Conservative Party didn't vote for him. The other two candidates withdrew, and then he just became prime minister. And they call that an act of democracy. Well, but Alex pointed out, wait a minute, nobody voted in any way. And then he compared that to the 2020 elections, in which he said what happened there was that Barack Obama made phone calls and told people to drop out. And what occurred was that people began to drop away. Bernie did something a little different, but essentially it was a process. And so when he talks about the control of the process in America, he doesn't, that is Mercouris in this case, he didn't leave out, and he wanted to make people clear about the role that he thought that Obama played. So I just want to first go to you, Harley, ask you what you think about that.
Well, what I think is most important is the issue that Anastasia and Stuart were raising was the role of Obama and Biden in organizing the 2014 Maidan coup, the regime change coup in Ukraine, which brought in the current government. Now, whether Obama is clever enough to be an Iago, whether Biden is foolish enough to be Othello, I mean, it's not a bad analogy. But the problem is that they actually believe they can manipulate things behind the scenes because of the control of the so-called media narrative that convince people that Ukraine is a democracy, that Ukraine is fighting for its sovereignty and freedom. And the fraud there, which I think many people around the world recognize, is that what actually happened after 2014 is that the International Monetary Fund and the European Union were brought into Ukraine to impose an even sharper, harsher austerity than during the shock therapy years in the 1990s and the early part of the 21st century. And so this wasn't about sovereignty. It was about debt collection. It was about using a nation that was on its knees as a target or as a battering ram against Russia. And so Obama is not merely using Biden for that, but he's actually, as you point out, as Mercouris was pointing out, the whole Democratic Party bowed to Obama when he said Biden's got to be the candidate. And now we see a situation where we're maybe poised on the verge of a significant crushing of the Democratic Party in the upcoming election. It's not clear for sure because so many of the Republicans also support the war. But it certainly is an interesting way to look at it.
Upgrade the question. Let's discard that question and to go back. Because number one, what just happened in this was he made a bad mistake. As you said, Stuart got him. Well, they both got him because that's how these things work. And so now the issue is he created the war. He knows he created the war. And he would normally just try to ignore it. But he knew he couldn't. He was caught. And these things are really, I think, extremely important to think about. As we are sitting here right now, Russia is asserting that Britain blew up the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines, and is asserting that they helped to supervise an attack on Sevastopol, which is, of course, that's a Russian city. I mean, that's a very, very, very serious situation. In fact, a situation which may, by tomorrow, not by Monday when the UN Security Council may meet and Russians may be putting forward their evidence, but it could be the case that in the next 24 hours, we see ourselves in a confrontation. And I think what gets interesting here to think about is that these forms of intervention that are being done in real time are shaping our world in ways which are completely unexpected. Individual citizens, people that don't have any ostensible power except one, the power of the truth, are having an impact here. So let me come back, and I actually want to take up one thing which Isa found herself in a situation, because Anastasia referenced that Diane Sayre has been the only candidate we know of. I mean, other than a few people who from the Congress, like Congressman Gosar of Arizona, that has to be noted, he's been doing something, and a couple of other people have at least questioned the war. We referenced that many of them are people in the Republican Party, but really, we see in New York a very important process. Diane's not with us today. She is, of course, I think, out campaigning or whatever she may be doing. But Isa, you found yourself in a circumstance there in New York where she's being excluded, and you can probably talk more about this, from the debates that are coming up. And I think you confronted one of the candidates in the debate. Is that right?
Yes, that is right. And again, she is one of 3 on the ballot. So to be the only one excluded is absolutely ludicrous. And again, this is the Republican nominee that I had no idea was going to be at the event that I was going to. It was in support of Lee Zeldin running for governor. And we were just going simply to pass out literature and, have good conversations with people about Diane and, the campaign. And within that time, we saw Joe Pinion, and he decided he was going to be going on stage. And there was no advertisement for him being there whatsoever. And I just really couldn't stomach what he was saying to these people that are just so desperate for new leadership. So I decided to say something.
So do we have that video, Jose?
Yeah, yes, we do. I can play it right now.
Joe, why won't you debate Diane Sayre? She's on the ballot for U.S. Senate in New York. You won't debate her. On October 30th, she's on the ballot, and she is the only pro-life candidate. She is the only pro-life candidate. Why can't I speak? Why can't I speak? She's the only pro-life candidate. Ask him if he is. Ask him if he is.
Let us be very clear.
Go ahead.
I have no problem with Diane Sayre. I don't make the rules of this crooked deep state. I only abide by what we must do in order to defeat the man who kept us from keeping America great, who defeat the man who in his watch has
Diane Sayre is the only hope, and you know it. You're terrified.
Yeah, so he says, I don't make the rules of this crooked deep state. I only abide by the rules of this crooked deep state.
Dennis, it's amazing. These guys indict themselves every time you confront them. Now, one of the points that was made on the AOC intervention is that she said previously that the job of the progressives is to break up business as usual, to be rude. And then when someone confronts her with the truth, she says, oh, you're rude. That's not acceptable. And this example today from Isa, perfect example, why you're not going to defeat Schumer by playing by Schumer's rules. And it's unfortunate. Maybe this guy thinks he's going to do it. But if he really wanted to defeat Schumer, Put Diane Sayre on the stage with Schumer. She'll tell the truth about him the way no Republican will. So I think that was another great example of the importance of citizens, especially younger people, speaking up and confronting the so-called powerful.
Bill, let me come back to you just for a minute, because you've seen many of these fools over as long a time as I have. What is it that you think it goes on, if anything, and what in the minds of these characters they're confronted? They always do this. I mean, you saw it with in the way Bill Weld case, I think, up in Boston, I think, with the Kerry debate. But there are many different cases.
William Weld in '96 was running against John Kerry for Senate, and there was a debate and a citizens panel asking questions of the candidates, and I had been organizing a whole lot of people in the constituencies, and one of their friends called me and said, "What should we ask?" And I told them, "Well, you should bring up the fact that William Weld covered up for the Iran-Contra operation, bringing cocaine into the United States to finance the Contra operation." And my friend's friend asked that question to William Weld, and he immediately began to denounce Lyndon LaRouche for spreading conspiracy theories. And he also, and the absurd idea that the Queen of England runs drugs. And I don't think people have seen William Weld much since then. Kind of, that 26 years ago, kind of disappeared. So I'd say that the issue with Schumer and AOC and Gillibrand and Joe Pinion, if you'll forgive me, they're in an empire state of mind.
Anastasia, I'd like to ask you a couple more questions about, because this just happened. Not merely we got a certain level of the reaction, but you probably got some other reactions as well, and just your sense of since so many people were there, you had the whole sort of array of characters from Michigan there. Just any further thoughts about what happened?
Well, just funny. I mean, obviously, everybody who was there was. I mean, if you can watch the whole video. Actually, Stuart's just informing me that they're talking about both of us now all over social media. So you can watch some of that there. We'll get out our own video soon. I mean, there's a lot of Obama support there, which is actually very terrifying. I mean, people who were organizers with us back when we were going after the impeachment of Obama as an organization might remember being assaulted, our signs being ripped up, being spat on and attacked. These were Obama supporters that did that. This is what really bothers me, is that we're being yelled at and called fascists. We're being called fascists, and we're the ones going after fascists. And I think we just got to set the record straight. This is complete BS. We're not right-wingers. We're the LaRouche movement. We have been going after the neocons and the fascists and all of these people since the creation of our organization. And it's just all complete lies. As I was walking out, somebody actually did put their hand on me, and I was a little bit nervous because everybody was putting their hands on me. But he said, "It was worth it. Good job. It was worth it." So there was somebody else in there who was also probably thinking about doing something similar. So anyway, just know that as well.
Very good. And then let me just ask, anybody else have a comment? I'm actually trying to find a letter, letting this be known to Jose, he may have it, from Colonel Richard Black, commenting about the situation on Diane Sayre. But while we're waiting, if there may be Kynan, you or Issa or Sam, anything?
As I was leaving the Warren Presley event, being escorted out, someone did tell me, which I think was genuine, that I did a good job also.
Hey, Dennis?
Yeah.
Yes.
If
Well,
I could say just one thing on the Gillibrand intervention. The idea that she acknowledged that she knew Diane was on a list, but wouldn't respond to the fact that she's funding, through her votes, the neo-Nazis who put Diane on a list is somewhat interesting. Even more so, what did she say? Don't worry, the FBI will protect you. Now, given what we know about the FBI, when was the last time the FBI found a Nazi that they didn't end up bringing into their own
intelligence service?
Yeah, I mean, think about the Michigan case where the gang of misfits who were supposedly going to kidnap Governor Whitmer, turns out that 2/3 of them were on FBI payroll. So the idea that somehow that should give Diane comfort and security just shows how out of touch these politicians are.
I just got a note, by the way, I'm coming to you in a minute, Kynan, that there's a Sayre for Senate rally where Diane is speaking. Was there any way that we can get in touch with them, Jose, or have anything from them?
Possibly. Just give me a second here.
Okay, why don't you do that? Kynan, go right ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was just thinking, I mean, I said that, that was my first time ever doing an intervention. And I think there's, a lot more people now that are considering doing it their first time, just from what all of us are doing, And there was also another intervention, which people might not know about, against Omar, which was covered. And she was, questioned on her funding of neo-Nazis and the fact that you have killings going on in the Donbass, which have been happening for 8 years. So I just, wanted to say that, it was wonderful doing it. And I hope that we continue to inspire people, because what we just heard about the Sevastopol incident, it makes it, we really got to get into this. I mean, because we don't know whether we're going to be surviving in the next day or so. So people have to stand up.
Okay, and Jose, any word on that thing with the Sayre campaign?
Yeah, it's going to take like just 20 seconds. I'm just bringing it into my computer. I have the letter from Colonel Richard Black that you also asked for.
Yeah. Why don't you bring that up on screen? Can you do that? Or,
yes, I can.
Or what are you going to do?
Right there. And, sorry. It's very loose today, but here we go.
Oh, you may also want to text it. Well, we'll do our best here. Okay. I am appalled that you have tentatively chosen to deny This is Colonel Richard Black, everybody. Let me just say who he is. People who've seen his videos, I think, a lot on this platform. And you know something about his background. He was a state senator also in Virginia, the state of Virginia, and was basically the head of the legal counsel, essentially, for the joint Judge Advocates General section of the Pentagon. He says, I am appalled that you have tentatively chosen to deny Ms. Diane Sayre the opportunity to participate in the upcoming debate for U.S. Senate. New York's requirement for petition signatures is remarkably stringent and obviously designed to deter independent candidates from standing for election. Nevertheless, 66,000 New York voters signed the nominating petition for Ms. Sayre, demonstrating that she enjoys widespread support across the state. No other candidate, male or female, came close to demonstrating her level of support. Spectrum News now plans to hold a debate that excludes the only woman candidate in the race. The two male candidates, Senator Chuck Schumer and Mr. Joe Pinion, will be allowed to debate, but the only woman candidate, Ms. Diane Sayre, will not. The format that you have chosen seems calculated to prevent voters from realizing that the name of an intelligent, knowledgeable woman will appear on the November ballot. Denying her the opportunity to appear along with her male opponents is particularly egregious since it denies New York's female voters the right to know that, against all odds, a top drawer female has become a candidate for this high office. You excused your decision to bar Ms. Sayre from participating by claiming that in order to debate, candidates must first demonstrate a 15% level of support in at least two of your pre-selected polls. However, as you know, it was impossible for Ms. Sayre to meet that requirement, since none of your polls, Marist College, Siena College, or Emerson College, ever gave those polled the option of choosing the sole woman candidate, Diane Sayre. Her name was intentionally omitted from the list of candidates. You have applied a grossly discriminatory standard to the sole woman candidate, making it mathematically impossible for her to participate in the debate. You say she must show support in polls that have systematically excluded her, denying voters the opportunity to select her regardless of how popular she might be. Discrimination based on sex has a long and unpleasant heritage. You should avoid the appearance of fostering that legacy of discrimination in your debate. I urge you to reconsider your decision. Reasonable people may conclude that you have chosen a methodology calculated to achieve a discriminatory outcome based on sex. I suggest that you reconsider and seek counsel. Maybe he means psychiatric counsel, actually, and seek counsel to determine whether the intentional exclusion of the only qualified female candidate, one who already met highly exclusionary state standards, might violate applicable state and federal civil rights laws. This, of course, raises an interesting question. Are Spectrum News and the various polling agencies guilty of violating the civil rights of a clearly qualified and publicly supported candidate for the United States Senate? Has New York State become Mississippi on the Hudson? Okay, so that's his letter. And I would just like to indicate, I may be able to retrieve this, that I believe that there was a response from that company, which is standing by their original corrupt decision. And I will probably be able, I think I got it here. Let me see if I can just indicate it to you. Yes. So their response was, sorry about this. Oh, here it is. So this is from Robert Hart. This is written to Diane Sayre, and it just says, as was noted in our communications dated October 13th, 2022, the fact remains that your candidacy did not satisfy the pre-established objective criteria we set. This fact is also amply demonstrated in your own supporting documents, which show that although not named as a separate candidate, your candidacy is effectively accounted for in the various polls under the other, another party's candidate, and someone else categories. That's it. That's it. That's what they say. Okay, now we know from two at least, or maybe perhaps more by now, of our persons that are supporters, they were actually polled, and they tried to use Diane's name and were told you can't make that choice. You can't say that. So this is going to be a sort of interesting week. The debate is tomorrow. So I think we, Mississippi on the Hudson, somebody asked that question, what that is. It refers to the Mississippi Democratic Party, which ran a system of what were called white primaries. It was run in Texas and in Mississippi. They were called the white primaries. Nobody black was allowed to vote. And the process of achieving the vote in Mississippi involved particularly the campaigning of someone by the name of Medgar Evers, who was assassinated the night of John F. Kennedy announcing his civil rights bill, June 12th, I think it was, of 1963. After that, it became a big cause. People like Bob Dylan wrote songs about it. People began to go down to Mississippi to try to get the right to vote. And there was something called Mississippi Freedom Summer that was organized in 1964, the following year. Young people from all over the country converged on Mississippi. And during that summer, what happened was that 3 of them were killed. 2 of them were from the New York area. Michael Schwerner and Goodman was the last name. I don't remember his first name. Andrew Goodman, I think it was, and James Chaney. James Chaney, who was African American and was from Mississippi. They were killed on a back road, pulled over by some police officers who were also Klansmen, and executed. And there's much to say about this. Later, by the way, his brother, James Chaney, who worked for a while at Ramsey Clark's firm, went to Mississippi together with our organizers, particularly Bob Baker, who does our farm work, and did a lot of work with us there in about matters pertaining to both ballot status, but other matters as well. And he also worked on the LaRouche case. That is, Chaney himself, who had his own legal history and had worked together with Ramsey Clark, was one of the people that did our case or worked on our case. So just thought, since somebody wanted to know what Mississippi on the Hudson means, what it means is the way that we're being treated, or people, the voters are being treated right now up here in New York, is what they call up south. It's like up south, where you are treated like cattle. There's other kinds of problems, but we will be saying more about that in later days. So that's what we said. I'm Ben Chaney. If I said James Chaney was his brother, I meant to say Ben Chaney. So Jose, do we have that anything from the rally?
Sure do. Yes, I'll play that now.
They're here out in front of Chelsea Market and Spectrum News, and I'm here because Spectrum News is refusing to allow me to participate in a debate which will involve only Senator Chuck Schumer, who's been in office for 42 years, because he and the FBI and the Wall Street thugs collaborate to threaten and terrorize anyone, and the Republican nominee, who really has no opinion on anything and agrees with Schumer on Russia being a threat to the United States. The censorship and the shenanigans occurring to rig elections by keeping people out of debates could end up plunging us into a nuclear war. Russia has just announced that they have evidence that the British were involved in bombing the Nord Stream pipelines. What do you think will be the next step? What should they do? What should we do? What would you think if you had a government which actually shut down your ability to have energy and heat your home in the winter? Oh, we do. We have Biden. We have the Green New Deal. We have the pipelines shut down. We have windmills and solar panels which can't possibly replace nuclear power plants like Indian Point. That's why you need my voice in the debate. That's why they are scared to debate me. So call up Spectrum News right now and demand, send them an email, here we go, and tell them that Diane Sayre must be included in the debate tomorrow night. I am the only candidate against nuclear war.
Okay. Let me first of all ask if anybody has anything that they'd like to say that they haven't yet said, and I'll start with, I know that Sam had to get going, but let me start with you, Kynan, and again, just whatever is on your mind. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, just responding to that video, I mean, it is completely absurd. You know, Diane is the only candidate who is standing against nuclear war. And the fact that you had this incident with the pipelines and the British being involved, it's absolutely insane. And she needs to be on that debate. And just considering, you know, Pinion's response, you know, he, like Bill said, you know, he claims that, you know, it's a corrupt system and he can't do anything about it. Well, then what is he worth then? You know, it's absolutely crazy. So I guess my only response is, well, yeah, we should make a push for this. We should have more interventions, and people should be making calls right now to Spectrum News to get Diane on that debate floor. So that's it.
Okay, great. Issa?
Well, I'm excited for the days to come, certainly, because yeah, Diane absolutely deserves to be in that room, involved in the debate. And just really quickly, I kind of wanted to frame what was happening in that video, for which I interjected. Pinion has a lot to say about the sanctity of life. And he will go into these churches where these people, again, are very, very vulnerable, and will speak to them about his 100-year-old grandmother that tragically passed away, and she would have lived another 10 years had she not been isolated because of COVID restrictions, whatever. But really this sob story and goes into Bible verses about how all life is predetermined and is, such a beautiful thing. That's really why I went into what I went into, because if he really was a pro-life candidate, as he dances around being, he wouldn't go against China and Russia, and he wouldn't villainize the people of Mexico as he does so often. Instead, he would be insisting that we can't go to war. He hasn't said anything about that at all. And he has no real plan to do anything, not only in New York, but otherwise. Truly, I wouldn't be surprised if he was an agent set up by the establishment just to distract from Diane's campaign. But I love that she's pushing back. And again, I'm excited for the coming days, so stay tuned.
Okay. Anastasia?
Yeah, I just like to pick up on something that Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaBruche has been bringing up a lot, that we need to have peaceful protests. We need to have people really take on this responsibility. And personally, I don't see our government taking on that responsibility. So I feel that personal responsibility to do that. I'm a citizen of a nation, and above all, I'm a world citizen. And the threat of nuclear war should not just be something brushed off as a campaign, my God, I mean, these guys are more worried about losing an election because we're bringing up nuclear war than they are about nuclear war. I mean, what the hell is this? This has got to stop. People are giving in to all sorts of practicality when our lives are on the line. So I want to encourage more and more people to do more peaceful protests, to go out into the streets and organize. Join us, call in, join us. We go out every day. We go out all the time. We're all over the country and all over the world. Doesn't matter where you're from. So people should, be worried about LaRouche because we do represent something which is honest and thoughtful, and we love humanity. So that's what I would like to say.
Okay. Bill?
Well, let me just repeat one of my favorite quotes from Shakespeare, which I've heard Jose reciting several times lately. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, then all the journey of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. And that may also apply to the British Navy very soon as well.
Well, Harley, as you, I think we're going to do something for you a little bit different. Let us, we have an excerpt from a speech given by JFK at Amherst College, October 26th. I believe that's actually maybe not the last time he addressed people. Of course, he did that in the course of his campaigning after that. But it's a very specific speech with regard to the poet Robert Frost, who has been a close friend of JFK. And he's giving this speech at Amherst We're going to play an excerpt of his words, and I'd like Harley to comment on this.
Just give me like 20 seconds for this. Sorry about
Okay, fine. And while you're doing that, let me also just thank everybody for being on. At Sam, Issa, Kynan, Bill, and Anastasia. I think that the Obama intervention let's put it this way, that was essential. And I think people, when they begin to take a good look at what happened there, they're going to understand what we're really dealing with when a president of the United States cannot respond in that way. Then, first of all, it shows you not something about the presidency of the United States. It shows you about the occupiers of that office recently. And it shows you something about the need for people like Diane and others, including some of the people that are doing the intervening, to perhaps be the replacements for those kinds of personages. And one other element is, I would just urge people, I didn't say this before, I meant to actually go read Vladimir Putin's speech. All this talk is being made about the Russians and how evil they are and so forth. Here's a head of state who stands in front of people for over 4 hours, speaking to them, not lecturing merely by the speech, but doing questions and answers and things that require you to think things through. And to think that that is all simply allowed to be dismissed without you, the citizen, knowing anything about it, should tell you the depth to which this country has in that sense sunk. But at the same time, it shows you that there's by the interventions that are being done, that it's a voluntary effort to not only return the country to its former stature, but to elevate ourselves to take on this process in a much different way. I want to just go to this video of Kennedy speaking about the role of the artist. Harley will respond, and then we will conclude for the evening.
In America, our heroes have customarily run to men of large accomplishments. But today, this college and country honors a man whose contribution was not to our size, but to our spirit, not to our political beliefs, but to our insight, not to our self-esteem, but to our self-comprehension. In honoring Robert Frost, we therefore can pay honor to the deepest sources of our national strength. That strength takes many forms, and the most obvious forms are not always the most significant. The men who create power make an indispensable contribution to the nation's greatness. But the men who question power make a contribution just as indispensable, especially when that questioning is disinterested. For they determine whether we use power or power uses us. Our national strength matters, but the spirit which informs and controls our strength matters just as much. This was the special significance of Robert Frost. He brought an unsparing instinct for reality to bear on the platitudes and pieties of society. His sense of the human tragedy fortified him against self-deception and easy consolation. I have been, he wrote, one acquainted with the night. And because he knew the midnight as well as the high noon, because he understood the ordeal as well as the triumph of the human spirit, he gave his age strength with which to overcome despair. At bottom, he held a deep faith in the spirit of man. And it's hardly an accident that Robert Frost coupled poetry and power, for he saw poetry as the means of saving power from itself. When power leads man towards arrogance, poetry reminds him of his limitations. When power narrows the areas of man's concern, Poetry reminds him of the richness and diversity of his existence and an officious state. The great artist is thus a solitary figure. He has, as Frost said, a lover's quarrel with the world. In pursuing his perceptions of reality, he must often sail against the currents of his time. This is not a popular role. If Robert Frost was much honored during his lifetime, it was because a good many preferred to ignore his darker truths. Yet, in retrospect, we see how the artist's fidelity has strengthened the fiber of our national life. If sometimes our great artists have been the most critical of our society, it is because their sensitivity and their concern for justice, which must motivate any true artist, makes him aware that our nation falls short of its highest potential. I see little of more importance to the future of our country and our civilization than full recognition of the place of the artist.
Harley?
Well, the case of Robert Frost and John Kennedy is a very interesting one. And I just was informed that Frost took a trip, and I believe sometime after the Cuban Missile Crisis, to Russia, to the Soviet Union, accompanied by Stuart Udall, who was the interior minister for the Kennedy administration. And he had several meetings with Soviet Chairman Khrushchev where they discussed art and poetry. And I think one thing that is important about what Kennedy is saying there is that it's that higher spirit which elevates man to be able to address the question of universal justice and to be able to stand up against the prevailing winds, as Kennedy did in resolving the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he had to stand up against most of his advisors, against the military, against the intelligence community, and he was moving toward a full détente with the Soviet Union when he was taken from us. Now, if you think about Khrushchev, he's most known, besides the Cuban Missile Crisis, for going to the United Nations, taking his shoe off, banging it on the podium and saying, "We will bury you." Now, instead of seeing that as the man himself, Kennedy looked beyond that. And, you know, it's interesting, Kennedy's known for his book, The Profiles in Courage. But the question of courage is not macho, it's not bravado. It's being able to face your own imperfections and to be able to understand that other people have frailties and concerns, but that the role of a statesman is to address the legitimate concerns of others without judgment. And I think this is what the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis is for today, that we need that kind of quality, not just in a president, because if you look at the cast of characters running, you don't see it. But what we saw from the young people and the elder statesman bill there that you had on this afternoon is that spirit of optimism and hope for the future. And it's going to have to come from the youth now, because the young people have a future laying out in front of them, uncertain, chaotic, but one which can bend to these higher principles of the human spirit. So I'm very happy you played that speech by Kennedy. I think it says a lot about the man and a lot that we don't know about him.
Yes, and I think it says a lot about the actual requirements of a United States president. As all of us know who are assembled here, we had a friend who ran for president many times, Lyndon LaRouche, and his idea of politics as art is exactly what we are attempting to practice here. I want to thank everybody for being with us today. And for all of you who've been watching today's program, The Politics of Truth, World's Citizens Mobilize to Halt World War III. We leave you with these words from the 24-year-old poet John Keats, who wrote in 1819 in his Ode to a Grecian Urn, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know."